Here we are. Okay. Well, thinking about climate justice, it's been in people's discussions quite a bit. It's on the news and so on. And I remember a few days ago on Radio Scotland, someone from the global south was asked about climate justice, and he said it's pretty simple. You industrial countries are largely responsible for climate change. Poorer countries, where I come from, suffer mostly from the consequences, and this is unfair. And unfairness is obviously a climate justice concept. So that's a very kind of basic idea that somehow there's just something basically unfair and unjust about the fact that many countries in the north have, over many years, been causing the problem, and now many poor countries are now suffering far worse consequences in terms of floods and droughts and changed temperatures and so on than we are in the north, though we are to some extent suffering now from it. So that's it. That's a very simple, basic idea. It's actually a lot more complicated because we then have to ask the question: well, what exactly makes it unfair, and what should we do about it? But I discovered in Wikipedia a broader statement, which I found interesting. It said something like this: climate justice is a term used to frame climate change as an ethical and political issue, rather than one that is purely environmental or physical in nature. And this is done by relating the cause and effects of climate change to the concept of justice, environmental justice, and social justice. Climate justice examines concepts such as equality, human rights, collective rights, and the historical responsibilities of climate change. So it covers many of the dimensions of global justice that I'm going to sort of briefly talk about. I think the first thing I want to say is that it doesn't sort of recognize that its first sentence is much broader than its later sentences, because the first sentence is simply to say climate justice is about ethics, the recognition that ethical issues and political issues are involved in thinking about how we respond to environmental issues. And the thing I want to say, first of all, is that it seems to me ethical issues are much more complicated than just talking about justice and fairness. And in fact, for many people, they wouldn't think of these issues in terms of justice, but they'd certainly think of it in terms of their responsibilities as ethical people, ethical beings. And indeed, myself, I've done work on global ethics as a philosopher for many, many years, both looking at development issues and environmental issues. And I've always just thought of it more in general terms of ethics rather than specifically about justice. But now I've come to think of it more in terms of justice. But the main point is that we can talk about ethical responsibilities without bringing justice in. I mean, consider um, something which ought to be the centre of all our thinking, the no harm principle. That's a principle enshrined in international law. It's absolutely fundamental to the Paris Agreement, and is what we're meant to be trying to do, is to get to a point in the future where we're not harming one another because we've got the net carbon net zero. I think we ought to be doing a lot more than that, by the way, but that we can discuss that later. But the point is the no harm principle is actually a very powerful principle. It's not actually about justice. It simply says we ought not to harm people. And it's a fundamental principle of almost every morality you can think of. And it seems quite straightforward in our personal relations. We don't kill people, steal from them, lie to them, do other things negatively towards them. But it's when you apply it to this kind of global impact and our contribution to it, that actually the harm principle becomes extremely challenging, even without bringing any fairness, justice considerations into the story. Um, and let's look at another key set of ideas which have been around for a long time in the environment debate. People talk about responsibility to mitigate and to adapt. And I would add, as part of adaptation, help with adaptation. And mitigate is to reduce our carbon emissions either by actually literally reducing them or carbon sinking things, sequestration. I think too much emphasis is put on the second rather than changing our behavior. That's another story. And then we have to adapt to the fact the thing is going to change. So we build dams and things like that if we're going to have flooding. But we ought to help also with adaptation in poorer countries where often they don't have the resources, technical and so on, to sufficiently adapt to what's happening to them already. So there's an issue about aid there. And my point is that does fairness and justice language add very much to these key concepts of no harm, mitigation, adaptation, etc.? I want to argue, yes, they do add something, but let's not think that um, we have to bring these concepts in order to make serious moral claims. Many people do without using them. And incidentally, there's an analogy here with aid, development aid, whether it's personal or charities or governments. Is aid primarily seen as a duty of benevolence, kindness, doing good, or is it more a duty of justice? And if it's a duty of justice, then we can think of it in a number of different ways. Justice might be about the rights of people, realizing them, and I'm going to argue that's a very important way of looking at these things. Or is it reducing our dependence on unjust economic relations? Or is it about compensating for past injustice? So I'm going to come back to these points shortly, but there's a parallel here. Indeed, I'm going to suggest there's parallels between trade issues like fair trade and climate change issues. And what makes it unfair in what senses? Well, as one or two things I read suggest, but it seems to me say this, it's partly a matter of distributive fairness. Fairness is about distribution, because inequalities are being caused by our emissions. And inequalities we can talk of as between countries as a whole, a lot of inequalities. Rich countries are producing far more of greenhouse gases than poor countries and so on. And the impact on countries are disproportionate. But also, very importantly, we need to talk about inequality in the distribution of what I call life chances. And the importance of this is because I think we have to accept that there are always going to be some inequalities in the economic conditions and situations of everyone. Perfect equality is a dream, in some ways a dangerous dream. But inequality is about ensuring, addressing inequalities, about ensuring that uh, um, people in poor countries are not deprived of the conditions of well-being and livelihood. In other words, equality must be about the distribution of equal access to those conditions which enable us all to thrive. That, to me, is the bottom line crucial point. And of course, if we talk about distribution, there's also the historical dimension. After all, rich countries have become wealthy by using high energy levels. So you sometimes hear the argument, which is a rather different argument, well, why shouldn't poorer countries catch up by doing the same? It's not a question of just our causing the harm in poorer countries. Why shouldn't poorer countries catch up by doing the same? And for my quick answer to this was, well, not necessarily if that means burning more fossil fuels, because that's part of a global problem. But yes, they ought to catch up. We in the West have an added duty to enable them to do so, by availing them of new technologies, new kinds of sources of energy, solar panels, etc., whatever it is. But there's another interesting question, which I was reminded of the other day in another talk when someone was talking about, we criticize China. Of course, China is a very big player in this. But when we say China is the biggest emitter of coal, carbon dioxide, the truth is that if you look at it as a per capita basis, the number of Chinese there are, it's still relatively low compared with what we tend to assume is being done for us. So there's another kind of issue there. And then there's procedural justice, the whole question of how decisions are made. And that has to do with questions of unequal power, unequal bargaining positions in international negotiations. And that's indeed, I've heard it said often, this is a big issue of our COP, because the large countries, the USA and so on, are sending large numbers of delegations, of people in their delegations, to, as it were, seek to influence outcomes which are going to be probably seen as in their favor. And very poor countries often only able to send a very small handful of people to represent them. So there's a real issue about whether poor countries really have a proper negotiating position in these big events. And I'm a Quaker, as some of you know, and the Quakers have been very concerned about trying to enable poor countries to have better voice and better representation all along in our voice in Geneva, but in our office in Geneva, but particularly at COP26, where a lot of Quakers in Glasgow are doing their best to try and facilitate proper participation by poorer countries. And here we have a parallel with fair trade, because, as I said at my seminar last week, one or two attended, um, this also involves distributive fairness, because the key point about fair trade is that farmers and workers get too small prices for their goods and labour. And what they ought to be having is a system, an arrangement whereby they get sufficient resources from their goods and labour, money and so on, to enable them and their families to fare well, which isn't often the case in other parts of the world. And this is a concept that might be called fair share. I'm a member of the Food Ethics Council, and we have this rather nice trio: fair share, fair play, and fair say. And I can say more about that later. But this is an example of making sure we all have a fair share of the goods that are available. But there's also procedural fairness here in fair trade, because economic contracts are often unfair because there's an unequal bargaining power. This is why in the fair trade movement, it's helping to establish cooperatives is so important, because cooperatives can either act independently or be more able to bargain with the big players. So that might be fair play. And it's very important that procedurally decisions are made democratically, that people have a proper voice in making decisions that affect them. That's what we call fair say. So there's a third factor, namely a very big and more controversial factor, is the compensation for past wrongs. Fair trade itself doesn't really touch this issue, but it's part of the wider economic picture. Here, for instance, climate change engages cumulative past emissions. And more generally, we have things like colonial exploitation in the past, and still patterns of exploitation because of the way economic relationships between countries are negotiated. So many people see this as a kind of neo-colonial aspect. And this, incidentally, is a very important dimension, increasingly so in discussions, the whole issue of racial injustice ever since the Black Lives Matter movement got going. And although some of these forms of exploitation are not done because explicitly of racial motivation, the fact that often the groups that suffer from exploitation are of a different color, as it were, lends to the thesis that in de facto it's a form of racial exploitation. And we compare that backward-looking way to a more forward-looking approach. And many people might prefer not to look back, but say we simply should, from now on, stop emitting high levels of CO2, etc., that cause harm. That's just being positive about what we should do in the future rather than looking back to the past. Maybe I'll pause just there, because I want to move now on to a more general idea of environmental justice and global justice. Does anyone want, at this point, to pick up a quick question or comment? Because I've tried to survey where I think climate justice issues are located.
I'd make maybe one comment, if you can hear me.
Who's that? Ian.
Ian, yeah. The comment is really you sort of explained the justice issue as very much a north-south, rich-poor country issue, which absolutely it is. But I would like to suggest it's not just that. It's also a class issue within our own country and the northern countries, between the ruling elites, if you like, and the working class. Once again, it's, all the benefits go to the top, all the impacts go to the bottom, 99% bottom. It's the working class folk who predominantly will have to suffer the key impacts. Those at the top have the means to ride them out if they need to. So it's a class issue, and even wider than that, if you will allow me to say so, I would suggest it's a species issue, in as much as it's humanity that's caused this problem, but it's not by any means just humanity that is suffering the consequences. So I'd like to suggest that there's a class issue and a species issue, as well as a north-south, rich-poor country issue.
Well, thanks, Ian. That's very well taken, those points. I'm going to go on to the species issue, because that's going to be in my next slide. In fact, it's the bottom of the slide, and you're just seeing at the moment. So you anticipate that. Thank you. It's part of I was saying, the wider understanding of environmental justice. On the class issue, yes, I take your point. There are many issues of what I would call social justice within societies, within countries like Britain. I mean, the gap between rich and poor in Britain is just atrocious at the moment. It's getting worse almost rather than better. So there are deep class issues in most countries, certainly in our country. The only thing I'd say why I haven't mentioned that in particular is because I'm trying to sort of get a handle on as it were, the global dimension to justice. Now, one of the things that's one has to acknowledge is that for all that we talk about global justice, that's not the only sphere of justice. There's also social, economic justice within smaller regions like or countries like Britain. And I entirely take your point. So I'm not going to talk about that much more unless we talk about discussion in this particular presentation, because I'm trying to focus on how climate justice feeds into the global justice framework. But you're absolutely right. That's another aspect of justice which we mustn't forget, and I wouldn't forget, and would talk about on another occasion. So, is that a reasonable reply?
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine. Thank you.
Well, thanks. That's good. It makes up the thing a little bit. So that's lovely to have that anyway.
And
But yes,
Nigel, I was going to say as well in response to the point there for me, and it is one that I'll possibly come back in and once we finish the presentation, because there's particular things that I think are worth exploring a little bit in that area.
yeah.
Related back to another meeting I was at a couple of weeks ago, and it really made me think about that class issue and ability to access well, a lot of the solutions, the government could find some solutions for the poorest in our country to heat their houses and so on. We'll come to that maybe towards the end.
But thanks. Yes, thanks, Ian, for a reminder that what I'm talking about is big scale thinking, but there are things at other levels that also need to be considered. So I'll just chug on for a little bit now, and I might have another pause, another break point. Now, the thing I wanted to really next say, as the head says here, I wanted to nest climate justice within the wider framework of environmental justice, because in a way, climate justice is a late newcomer to the scene of global justice thinking, and environmental justice discourse has been around for quite a bit longer, has indeed economic justice issues have gone on for even longer than that. So they're relative newcomers to the global justice framework. Um, so about environmental justice, um, it seems to me that more broadly it has both a narrow and a broader interpretation. The narrow interpretation, if you look at some of the literature historically, has been about the specific problem of the distribution of environmental bad things. So, for instance, when a city um, locates its waste dump, um, then this waste dump will tend to be close to poorer classes. So, in fact, this is precisely what Ian was picking up. It becomes an issue of discrimination vis-a-vis different social classes. And that's all too often the case when you look at it. That most of the pollution and waste in a country is produced by everyone, particularly the well-off, tends to be located where those least well-off exist. And that's often specifically what environmental justice was seen. It was about the distribution of environmental bads, if you like. And this is linked to another form of it, on the like international corollary of that, is where rich countries often export waste and dump it in poorer countries. Again, we're just putting our toxic waste somewhere else where poor people can suffer there, as opposed to having to deal with it properly in our own country. And by the way, I heard a very interesting talk recently in the other series I'm involved in from Ian Gulland, who's the director of Waste Scotland, Zero Waste Scotland, and he said that we're missing a trick here. When we recycle things and we break things up, if we don't recycle them by reusing them, if we recycle them into their component parts, what do? We tend to export all that stuff elsewhere. But actually, if we kept it in Scotland or Britain, we could produce for every job in recycling, we could produce 9 jobs of people using the recycled bits to make new things. And that's all part of the kind of concept of the circular economy, which I'm also very interested in. That's by the way, sorry. Anyway, and another example which is often quoted is Hurricane Katrina, which of course hit a rich country, namely USA, and other countries in the Caribbean. But it hit, in particular, New Orleans, and there's plenty of evidence that the people who suffered in New Orleans because of this environmental impact were very poor people, black people, because that's where they were located in the most dangerous and vulnerable areas. So the narrow concept of environmental justice is about, as I say, the distribution of environmental bad. But the broader concept of environmental justice I've been very interested in over a long period, and that is, it's the general habits or environmental habits that need to be understood or cast in terms of the impacts they have on all other groups. And I've argued for a long time, you're pleased to know this, Ian, I've argued for a long time that it's not just looking at the global impact of our environmental habits, the footprint we have on other parts of the world, but on the impact on future generations, which of course has been publicly acknowledged in the Brundtland definition of sustainability, but also on non-human life. I mean, I'm very concerned about the way our modern patterns of development often trample without much regard on the life conditions of non-human life. And that seems to me to be a moral issue as well, of a very serious kind. And again, all these 3 concerns can be just expressed in a general ethical way, but you'll find people talking about international justice, intergenerational justice, and interspecies justice, or international fairness, intergenerational fairness, and interspecies fairness. So this is a broader brush idea of environmental justice beyond, alongside the narrower concept. And now we turn to global justice, because I want to say that we still only have part of the picture of what the broader concept of global justice covers. And indeed, long before climate justice and even environmental justice came to be a concern to many, there have been concerns about international economic trade, economic justice, and trade justice. Because it's an interesting thing, which, if we look at fair trade, which I'm a very keen advocate of, and I mean, even Fairer World is very keen on this, promoting it in the city and so on. Fair trade, as it were, doesn't address these wider structural issues. It simply says, let's have more and more trade that's produced under fair conditions in local areas through cooperatives and so on and so forth. And I'm entirely in favor of developing all those things, but it's not a solution to some of the more deep structural issues in the way the whole international economic system works. It seems to me that although I'm not against the idea of patents, because it does encourage research and innovation, I think the whole way the international intellectual property rights regime works in the world is just too favoured and too stacked in favour of those whose rights are exercised. We've seen this in a number of things like drugs for AIDS and so on some time ago. And indeed, the vaccine issue is one that's been this issue a bit. And then there's the whole issue of tax havens. Now, these are not strictly illegal, possibly in most cases, but Christian Aid argued quite a number of years ago that the amount of money that big companies could put into tax havens and therefore evaded or avoided, depending on how you look at it, paying tax either in poor countries or rich countries on their goods, amount. It total was more than the total public and private aid budget of all people and countries. That was what they came out with a number of years ago. Christian Aid did a report. It's a massive amount of money that is, siphoned away, as it were. And if proper tax were paid for materials in poor countries, then poor countries would have much better access to economic well-being. More generally, when I first came in, got interested in this whole issue in the 70s, the whole discussion was of terms of trade. And often they were unfair to poorer countries because they didn't have enough power to negotiate better deals for them. And so there's the whole question of the structure of international governance, which is an issue here. Anyway, one way in which we can frame global justice is through the lens of human rights. But before I come on to that more detail, because it's now, in a sense, a new section to my talk, does anyone want to comment on anything, particularly what I said about environmental justice more generally, or global justice so far? Or are you just totally stunned by it all? But anyway, I just thought I could pause there just in case there was something you wanted to pick up before we lost it later. If not, I'll just chug on because I've not too much more to say. How are we doing for time? No, not too much. One way of framing, as I said, the global issue, global justice issue, is through the lens of human rights. And I've been long attracted to this as a way of thinking about justice. So basically, a just system is one in which everyone's human rights are basically realized. And an unjust system or practices are those which undermine or impede the realization of human rights. And this is a particular way of understanding global justice. Um, and I now want to present to you I mean, this is obviously only one of many different approaches. Philosophers interested in these come up with all sorts of different theories, and I hope that's taken as read, and I'm just giving you one particular take that's interested me over some years. What I'm suggesting is a basic rights model of climate justice as part of global justice. So one model is that basic rights all human beings have to things like water, food, healthcare, economic security, clean environment. These are fundamental rights because if we don't have these in place, then the rest of life becomes very, very difficult. We can't realize all our diverse interests, projects, and have a good life or a meaningful life. So these things need to be in place at a basic level. And incidentally, I would even prefer a worldie and is very interested in the right to water. It's going to be one of the themes of what we've been working on recently. And if we accept this basic model that we ought to be organizing things in such a way, basic rights to all humans, not just in our own country, but all humans have access to adequate water, clean water, food, etc. If we have that, then how is it to be achieved? And here I was very influenced by a book many years ago, and there are all sorts of other things in the background I'm not referencing because it's not an academic paper, this, but a book I was particularly impressed by was a book by Henry Chew called Basic Rights, Subsistence, Affluence, and U.S. Foreign Policy. And the first part, which is on the basic theory, I found very, very persuasive because he claims that there are three types of rights corresponding to all these basic rights. First of all, we have clearly a duty not to deprive people of these rights. We don't take things away from prevent them from achieving what they have a right to. Then we have a duty to come to the aid of or assistance of people whose rights are undermined. And it may be natural causes undermine them or the evil wrongdoing of other people. But if people are, don't have enough food or are homeless or whatever, then we have a duty collectively to assist people. And incidentally, Hank Chu, provides this basic idea. Basic rights are the minimum demand of whole humanity on whole humanity. Anyway, but more interestingly, in addition to duty not to deprive and the duty to come to assistance, the third duty, which to me, or I've reflected on it over the years, is actually incredibly important. It's often not the first thing people discuss when they discuss rights. And it's to provide the basic conditions for the realization of rights. In other words, we need to create social economic conditions nationally and globally, which enable people, generally speaking, to achieve their rights. And this is interestingly very much linked to the little noticed Article 28 of the Universal Declaration of Rights. I mean, most people know this Universal Declaration. I think it's very important as a framework for later legislation on international law and so on. But there's this fairly late clause in it, which the impact of which I don't think is fully recognized by most people most of the time, because it says everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. So what it's saying is we need to organize international agreements and organize the way the world runs, as well as in social order within countries, which goes back to Ian's point about addressing inequality. We need to have an order in which the rights, or these basic rights, can be fully realized. So that means as we're providing the infrastructure, the conditions in which people can have a healthy life, by having a proper health service, by having education, so people can develop the skills to make something of their lives, so to have background provision of resources for people who are in need and so on. So to me, this framework of rights is, to me, a very powerful way of understanding what global justice is about. It may be about rather more than this, but surely it's about that. So as part of that framework of thinking of rights and global justice, I want to say that one way of thinking usefully of climate justice is having rights to a stable environment. From this perspective, climate justice is about ensuring that everyone exercises their right to live in this is the way I'd put it, a clean, stable, life-sustaining and safe environment. It's clean because it's not contaminated and polluted. It's stable because it's not liable to be changing all the time. It's got enough in it to sustain life, and it's safe in all sorts of other ways. And to me, that is an important bottom line idea for thinking about what we need to do to achieve climate justice, apart from all the specific things that have been mentioned earlier. And the corollary of this is something a bit surprising, and I've met this in one or two articles, particularly by a friend of mine called Robin Attfield, who argues basically from the other end, looking at the other end of the telescope, as it were. It's not so much focusing on the right of, say, poor people to have access to this environment, this safe and stable environment, and all the other things that we have basic rights to. More looking at the end of the rest of us, those who are higher consumers and so on. What is then argued by some people is we all have a right to that share of the benefits of the atmosphere or atmospheric commons is consistent with everyone having a like access. In other words, the idea here is that we can work out what our share of the atmosphere is in terms of the amount of carbon we emit and so on. But our share, we have a right to know more than that, because if we don't exceed our share, then we're going to make it more difficult for other people to achieve their share of the environment. So it's a different focus. It's very challenging. Although I have to say that I have met various people who are now arguing we need to work out what the level of carbon emissions is that we are entitled to as an individual, as a consumer, and so on. And then we must try and make sure our actions fit that level. And the various calculations are made of what if like our carbon, each of us's personal carbon budget would be. I quite like this approach, but I'm a bit skeptical about how you can precisely calculate it. But I think it makes a good point that we don't just focus on the rights of the poor people or the less advantaged people in the world. We focus on the rights of those who could do a lot more. In other words, the rights of high energy users, resources by setting limits. So that to me is an interesting aspect of it too. So here we have a summary of what I've been saying. I want to say that we have global justice in the middle here as the core grand concept, the overarching comprehensive concept. And one way of interpreting it, which I favour, is the realization of human rights on a universal scale. And then we have various dimensions of it. We have environmental justice, but as part of environmental justice, we also have climate justice, we have interspecies justice, and all sorts of other things. And then at the bottom, we have economic justice as a big dimension of global justice, and then there are all sorts of different dimensions to economic justice, trade justice, and so on, and fair trade as part of that. On the left, I've put other human rights issues, because there are many other issues to do with the rights human beings have, rights to their cultural identity, non-discrimination, and so on and so forth. The sorts of things that Amnesty are very interested in. These are also parts of the global justice framework, but I've not talked about that tonight. And then there are more general issues I've touched on, but haven't said a lot about, the need to think in terms of what is a just way of engaging in governance, particularly at the global level. So these are all, and maybe others, the dimensions of global justice. And I've tried to indicate that climate justice has to be nested within this whole framework. Just for fun, there's a little diagram here I used for another talk some time ago, which I think I called Petricuccia, where I had to use a series of images. And I tried to indicate global justice as the elephant. And we have all these dimensions of global justice, and all too often each area of concern doesn't speak to or recognize the other areas. So you all recognize the elephant metaphor about the blind people each feeling different parts of the elephant. But I want to say we need to take our blindfolds off and recognize the totality of it all. And this leads into my final point about injustice and justice. I was much struck by something in a book some years ago by Amartya Sen, who's one of my heroes. He talks all about development issues. He wrote a book on the idea of justice. And one of his key points is we can agree on what constitutes significant injustices and unfairnesses and inequalities much more easily than we can disagree about exactly what justice and fairness means or would really amount to. In other words, we can have different views about what a really just world would look like, but we might all agree that this is an unfair practice, or this is unfair that the rich cause all the environmental damage and the poor countries have the consequences. That's all. We can agree on these judgments, but we might not disagree necessarily on exactly what we mean at the other end when we talk about perfect justice. We can disagree about what the theories are. And this leads to a theme I've explored for a lot of my work on what's the idea of a global ethic, which can be shared values, but have diverse theories for supporting them. And even if you don't like the theories that I've been putting forward about global justice, I hope you'll accept the general idea of global justice as something within which our particular ideas of climate justice can be nested, as I said. Finally, another picture for you. I once gave a talk years ago on this idea of shared values, in which shared values, different worldviews supporting them, and different ways of expressing them in different contexts. And a student gave a talk on my lecture that I wanted to call Dower's theory the cat's whiskers theory of ethics. So that's why my cat is superimposed on this image. Thank you very much.